Good evening, and welcome back to Wisdom by the Fireside. Tonight, the fire burns a little lower, not from lack of warmth, but from reverence. Because in today's event story, we step into a time when the entire nation sat in darkness, not from war or plague, but from something far quieter and far crueler. This is the story of when America lost everything: money, jobs, homes, even hope. But somehow, not faith. What happens when a whole country forgets the ground beneath it is borrowed? What breaks when pride replaces prayer? And what remains when the banks are empty, but the soul still aches to give? Let's go back to October 1929. It was a golden season, or so it seemed. Jazz bands played in glittering clubs, young couples danced the Charleston, and Wall Street climbed like a tower, scraping heaven. In cities like New York and Chicago, money poured through the streets like champagne, and the future felt invincible. But underneath that golden glow was a sickness, a quiet arrogance, speculation, greed, borrowed wealth, the kind of confidence that thinks it no longer needs grace. And then, the tower cracked. Black Tuesday, they would call it, October 29th, the day the market fell not just in numbers, but like a soul collapsing under its own weight. Billions vanished in hours. Fortunes turned to dust. Grown men wept outside banks. Some jumped, but that was only the beginning. Out in Kansas, on a dry patch of farmland, lived a widow named Clara Dawson. She wasn't watching the markets, she was watching her pantry shrink. The last rain had been in spring, and now the earth cracked like old leather. Her husband had died the year before, and the bank had been kind, until it wasn't. Clara had 3 sons, each with calloused hands and hollow eyes. They weren't starving, not yet, but there was a silence around the dinner table that didn't exist before. It was the kind of silence where even prayer felt heavy. One morning, Clara walked 10 miles to town, in shoes worn thin, just to ask the bank manager for an extension. His name was Mr. Redford, a thin man with steel glasses and tired eyes. He didn't smile when she walked in, just tapped his pen and asked for her file. Clara didn't beg. She just looked him in the eye and said, "I have nothing to give but my word and my prayers. I reckon God won't forget us. I only ask that you don't, either." Mr. Redford didn't answer right away. He closed the file, looked out the window, and said softly, "My sister lost her house last week, and my brother, his store's gone. I'm not sure who I'm working for anymore." Then he pulled out a sealed envelope from his drawer. "Don't open this until you get home," he said, "and don't ask questions." Clara hesitated. "What is it?" "Let's just say it's grace," he said. She opened it on the walk back. Inside was $200, more than enough to pay the overdue loan. But what she didn't know was that Mr. Redford would lose his job for it. And yet, he told no one, not even his wife, because some men knew that even when the world is crumbling, a single act of mercy can hold up the roof of heaven. But what Clara would do with that money would echo far beyond her little farm. Because faith, once planted in a drought, grows roots no storm can tear loose. What she did next, well, That's where the miracle begins. Clara didn't sleep that night. The money sat in a coffee tin beside her Bible, untouched. Her boys were already snoring in their shared bed, and the wind outside clawed at the wooden boards like a ghost looking for warmth. But her mind was full. $200. Enough to buy grain for planting, enough to patch the roof, enough to make it through winter. Barely. But it wasn't just the money, it was what Mr. Redford had called it. Grace. And Clara couldn't shake the feeling that grace isn't something you hoard. By sunrise, she'd made her decision. She divided the money into 3 envelopes, one for her family's needs. The other 2, she placed into old flour sacks and stitched them shut with trembling hands. Then she tied on her bonnet, kissed her boys' heads, and walked, this time, west, not east. But why would a starving widow give away the very thing that saved her? Just 5 miles down the dusty road lived the Alvarezes, a Mexican-American family who had migrated to Kansas for farm work 2 years earlier. But the work had dried up, along with the land. They had 5 children, and no shoes between them. The father, Mateo, had been trying to fix a broken plow using scrap iron and prayer. His wife, Rosa, had just given birth 2 weeks earlier on a bed of burlap. When Clara knocked on the door, Rosa opened it in silence, her eyes full of questions and not enough sleep. Clara didn't speak either. She just reached into her flour sack and placed the envelope on their small kitchen table. Then, without waiting, she whispered, "God sees you," and turned to leave. She made a second stop at a church. Not her church, but one she had passed many times. Black-run, Baptist, and full of song on Sundays. The building was small and faded, but the spirit inside was known across counties. The pastor, Reverend James Brooks, was sweeping the porch when Clara approached. He had heard of her, the strong widow, the woman who prayed with her eyes open and worked like 3 men. She handed him the second envelope and said, "For those who need it most." No names, just food, or blankets, or hope. Reverend Brooks looked at her with tears pooling in his tired eyes. "Miss Dawson," he said, "I've been asking the Lord all week how we were going to make it through another Sabbath." Clara smiled gently. He tends to send answers with dust on their boots. What Clara didn't know was that one of the boys in that church, 10-year-old Emmett Jackson, would one day become a civil rights lawyer in Chicago, citing that winter as the moment he knew God was real. And Mateo Alvarez's daughter, Sophia, would grow up to open a soup kitchen in Topeka named Clara's Hands. Clara never asked for thanks, never told her sons what she had done. But something changed in her house after that. The silence at the dinner table turned to humming. The boys fought less. The crops, against all odds, sprouted early that spring. And when the bank finally repossessed the farm 3 years later, Clara didn't cry. Because she had long ago decided if God gave her something, it was never just for her. But the depression wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. Across the country, in a place where the streets were made of soot and dreams, a man named Walter Fields was about to face a different kind of trial. He had never farmed a day in his life. He was a banker, and he was about to lose everything except his faith. Walter Fields wore suits tailored in silence. The kind of man who said little and noticed everything. In 1928, he was a rising star at a Wall Street investment firm, sharp, calm, and gifted at making rich men richer. His wife, Eloise, hosted teas on Thursday afternoons in their Manhattan brownstone, while their son, Henry, studied Latin at an elite school. To the world, Walter was the definition of made it. But inside, he was restless. He had grown up the son of a church janitor in Baltimore. His hands had once known broom handles and hymn books, but those memories had faded behind mahogany desks and white linen collars. He still believed in God, technically, but he hadn't spoken to him in years. And when Black Tuesday came, it wasn't just the market that fell, it was everything. Overnight, the firm collapsed. Walter's accounts were frozen. His name, once whispered in reverent circles, vanished from office doors. By November, they had sold the brownstone. By December, they were sleeping in the basement of Eloise's cousin's house in Queens. But the worst came one bitter night in January 1930, when Walter returned from a humiliating job interview to find his wife curled up in bed, clutching a photograph of their son. Henry had been sent to live with relatives in Boston. They couldn't afford to keep him. Walter stood there in the dark, jobless, childless, nearly faithless. He slipped outside and walked for hours with no coat, no plan, and, he thought, no purpose. And then he heard it, a voice, not loud, not dramatic, just one word, whispered deep in his chest: pray. He hadn't prayed aloud since he was 16. But that night, on a frozen bench under a lamppost near 138th Street, Walter Fields closed his eyes and whispered a prayer that came out more like a breath than a plea. God, I got proud. I forgot. If you'll take me back, I'll go where you send me. The next morning, Eloise found him kneeling in their tiny kitchen, hands still trembling, face wet with a kind of peace she hadn't seen in years. He didn't get a job that week, or the next, but he did meet a man named Reverend Lionel Ware, who ran a struggling mission shelter near Harlem. The shelter was short-staffed, overcrowded, desperate. Walter offered to help, just for a few days. Those few days turned into months. Walter scrubbed floors again, served soup, managed ledgers, prayed with drunks and widows and orphans. The men laughed when he first walked in, a banker in broken shoes. But over time, they came to him for counsel, for comfort. He even started holding prayer circles. By the end of that year, Walter Fields had helped turn the mission into one of New York's most reliable shelters, serving thousands through the coldest years of the Depression. One night, as he led a man through a prayer for sobriety, someone whispered, "What made you stay?" Walter smiled. "I thought I lost everything," he said, "but God stripped me down to show me what everything really is." In 1951, President Truman would cite Walter Fields as one of the unsung architects of dignity during the Depression. But back then, Walter didn't know any of that. He just knew that when pride fell, grace had room to walk in, and sometimes it comes on foot, in broken shoes, holding a ladle. But while Walter found his redemption in a Harlem mission, across the country, in the hills of West Virginia, a 12-year-old girl named Martha Jean was about to make a decision that would alter generations. And she was all alone. The hills around Fayette County, West Virginia, were cold that March, cold enough to freeze the creek beds and rattle tin roofs like bones. Inside a one-room cabin, nestled between two pine ridges, 12-year-old Martha Jean Holloway sat in the dark, listening to the wind scratch against the shutters. She hadn't eaten since the night before last. Her father had been crushed in a mining accident 3 months earlier. Her mother, frail and sickly, had passed just before Christmas. And now, with no one left to claim her, Martha Jean had simply stayed in the cabin they once called home. Neighbors had tried to help, but the depression didn't spare sympathy. Everyone was rationing. Everyone was drowning just a little slower. Still, they dropped off scraps when they could. Half a loaf of bread, some beans, a wool scarf. Martha Jean kept to herself. She read her father's old Bible by lantern light, especially the Psalms, and whispered prayers she barely understood. But something in her wouldn't quit. One morning, while patching a hole in her boot with newspaper, she read a verse that stuck to her ribs. "I have been young, and now am old. Yet have I not seen the righteous forsaken, nor his seed begging bread." She folded the paper, tied the boot, and stood up. It was time. She packed her father's Bible, a tin spoon, and one quilt into a flour sack and stepped out onto the frosted earth. She walked 11 miles into Oak Hill. At the church near the town square, she knocked on the door, not the front, but the back, where the kitchen was. The pastor, Elias Monroe, opened it, expecting to find the coal delivery boy. What he found was a 12-year-old girl, mud on her hem, eyes like flint, and a voice that didn't tremble. "I can clean and sing," she said. "I can quote scripture too. But I ain't begging. I'm asking." He stared at her, then smiled. The next Sunday, Martha Jean stood at the front of the small wooden church and sang "His Eye is on the Sparrow," in a voice so pure the older women wept. She moved into a room above the church, helped in the kitchen, was enrolled in school, and slowly she grew. But what nobody saw was what happened after the service that first Sunday. A man in the back, newly widowed and halfway to despair, came to Pastor Monroe and said, "That girl, that voice, I hadn't planned to stay alive past tonight." Martha Jean never knew it, but her courage saved a man's life. And years later, that same man, David Cole, would go on to fund scholarships for Appalachian girls in her name. Sometimes it isn't the voice that saves the world. It's the decision to sing when no one expects you to. By the time she turned 20, Martha Jean Holloway was a music teacher in 3 counties, riding between towns on horseback to bring children hope through hymns, and in a shack once filled with silence, the neighbors began to say, "That girl brought music back to the mountains." But while the mountains found their melody, the dust was coming for the heartland. And one boy in Oklahoma was about to watch the sky turn black. In Boise City, Oklahoma, the wind didn't whistle anymore. It howled. The year was 1935, and for 15-year-old Caleb Withers, the sound had become background noise, like breathing or grief. He had lived his whole life on this patch of parched land, where once wheat grew tall and golden. But now the fields were brittle and bare, and the sky hung low with dust, like a promise you couldn't trust. His father, once the proud owner of 240 acres, hadn't spoken a full sentence in weeks. His mother coughed blood at night, but still forced a smile at breakfast. And Caleb, well, Caleb just tried not to cry in front of his little sister, June. They had lost their livestock. The well was half mud. Every day they stuffed rags into the cracks in the walls to keep the dust out. Every night they prayed it wouldn't find a way in anyway. But on April 14th, 1935, the sky finally broke. It was Sunday. They called it Black Sunday. That morning the sun rose like usual, pale and weary. Caleb and his family walked to church, wearing hand-me-downs and courage. The sermon was short, the hymns quiet. Nobody had much strength. Then, just before noon, it hit. A black wall of dust, 200 miles wide, rolled over the plains like judgment itself. It moved with fury, swallowing homes, choking cattle, blotting out the sky. Inside the church, the walls trembled. Mothers clutched babies. Old men wept. And Caleb, he ran. Not away, but toward home. June had been left with a neighbor who hadn't come to church. Caleb knew if the storm reached them first, she'd be lost in the suffocating dark. The dust clawed at his eyes. The wind screamed in his ears. He tied a wet handkerchief over his mouth and ran blindly through a world turned to ash. He found her on the front porch, barefoot and crying. He wrapped her in his coat, held her against his chest, and dragged her into the storm cellar, where he held her for hours, telling her Bible stories between coughs. When the storm passed, nearly everything was gone. The barn had collapsed. The chickens were dead, but the house barely stood. And so did they. Weeks later, a reporter from the Daily Oklahoman came through town, documenting the devastation. He met Caleb, heard his story, and published it on the front page with the headline, "Boy Brings Sister Through Hell." But Caleb didn't care for the attention. He only said, "I didn't save her. God gave me legs and breath, and a sister worth running for. That was enough." What Caleb didn't know was that his story would inspire donations from across the country. A church in Pennsylvania sent food. A woman in Georgia sent blankets. A school in Minnesota sent books. And for the first time in years, Boise City had hope. When the sky turns black, you learn what lights are still burning inside you. Years later, June would become a nurse in Kansas City and keep a photo of that headline in her wallet for the rest of her life. And Caleb? He went on to become a pastor, but not the kind with a suit and pulpit. He was the kind who walked into barns and fields and broken homes and said, "I've seen the dark, but I've also seen who pulls us through." And just like that, even in the dust, the Depression had planted another seed of faith. But far away, in the tenements of New York City, an immigrant mother was fighting a different storm. And this one would demand a sacrifice no one saw coming. In the Lower East Side of New York City, the Depression didn't come with dust or silence. It came with noise, babies crying in shared hallways, arguments over bread, the screech of trains above ground, and the quiet panic of men returning home, empty-handed. Again. In a crumbling tenement on Delancey Street lived Anya Lisovsky, a Russian Jewish immigrant who had come to America with nothing but a daughter and a dream stitched into her apron. Her husband had died of pneumonia 2 years after they arrived. Since then, it had just been her and Leah, age 9, both surviving on what Anya could sew, clean, or carry. They weren't poor. They were invisible. But Anya never missed a sunrise without prayer. She didn't speak much English, but she knew the word faith. She used it often. And though her back ached and her hands cracked from winter's bite, she still hummed lullabies in Yiddish and lit a candle every Friday night. One day, word spread through the tenement. The Lisovskys have been evicted. The landlord hadn't waited for the rent. He wanted the room for his brother. Anya and Leah were put out on the street with 2 suitcases and 1 blanket. It was snowing. Neighbors turned away, not from cruelty, but from helplessness. Anya stood there, gripping Leah's hand, when a strange voice called out from behind, "Ma'am, come inside, please." It was a woman named Agnes, a widow in her 50s, who lived down the block. She had a cramped apartment, already full of grandchildren, but she opened her door. That night, Anya served Agnes's family. She cooked, cleaned, and even patched a torn dress with a needle she had carried from Russia. The next morning, Agnes handed her $5 and said, "We may be poor, but we can still be rich in mercy." Anya cried for the first time since arriving in America. The story might have ended there, but the woman who watched all of this from across the hallway, a volunteer teacher named Ruth Goldman, told her uncle, who happened to run a garment factory in Brooklyn. 2 weeks later, Anya had a job, sewing 12 hours a day, but with dignity. She saved every cent. In 1939, she opened a tiny tailor shop with her daughter, who by then spoke fluent English and wanted to be a writer. The sign over the shop read, "Grace and Thread." But the real story wasn't the shop. It was what Anya did with it. Every Friday afternoon, she closed early, left 2 loaves of challah and a few dollars inside a brown paper bag on the steps of someone in the neighborhood who had less than she did. No one ever saw her do it, but they began to call her the Shabbat Angel. Years later, when Leah published her first novel, the dedication read, "For my mother, who gave everything, even when she had nothing, and for the woman who let her in that snowy night when the world forgot us. Sometimes, the greatest miracle isn't the money or the job or even the rescue. It's the moment someone chooses to see you when everyone else walks by. And just like that, in the cold streets of the city, another quiet spark of faith flickered to life. But while America scraped and prayed its way through the 30s, the question still lingered in the air, like smoke. Had we learned anything, or were we just waiting for the lights to come back on? By 1938, the storm had lasted nearly a decade. 10 years of loss, rationing, borrowed shoes, and broken dreams. The stock market had begun to twitch with life again. Yes, but in kitchens and church basements, in barns and soup lines, the real question echoed louder than any recovery headline. Will it ever be like before? But maybe that was the wrong question. Because some things, some people, had changed forever, and they wouldn't want to go back. In Birmingham, Alabama, a retired schoolteacher named Nettie Harris found herself watching the world through new eyes. She had spent most of her life behind a desk, raising children who weren't hers, with chalk and scripture. She never married, never had children, but she was never alone. Nettie had a habit, though, an odd one, folks said. Every morning since 1931, she would sit on her porch at dawn with a notepad and write down the name of one person she would pray for that day. She called it her daily mercy. It might be the name of someone from her past, a boy at the store with hungry eyes, or even someone she'd only overheard in the post office line. She didn't ask for anything in return, didn't even tell them, but she kept the notepads. By 1938, she had filled 23 of them. One day, a young reporter named Clarence Boyd came knocking. He was writing a series on ordinary people of the Depression. Nettie agreed to speak, reluctantly, and only if he stayed for tea. When he asked her, "What did you do to survive all this?" she answered, "I made other people's burdens my own." Clarence smiled politely and wrote a short column about the porch woman with a pencil and a heart. But 3 months later, he came back with tears in his eyes. He'd gone through a dark stretch, lost his job, lost someone he loved, nearly jumped into the river one night. Then he remembered Nettie's words and called her. She prayed with him over the phone for 23 minutes. That call saved his life, and it became the opening story of a book he would publish 2 years later, The Light We Didn't See. He dedicated it to her, for Nettie Harris, who saved people without ever knowing it. When she passed away in 1946, they found 57 full notepads, names, dates, a nation's worth of quiet mercy. Her last entry simply read, "For whoever needs it most today, let them feel less alone." We may never know how many people were carried by those words, but in that porch chair, in that fragile body with a pencil in hand, the divine moved, not through power or wealth or miracles of fire, but through steady, unseen love. And maybe that was the whole point of the Depression. Maybe it wasn't a punishment, but a pruning, a stripping away of the false, the proud, the shallow. So what was left could finally bear fruit. But before the curtain fell, on that long night in history, there was one more story, one final quiet moment, in a small-town cemetery in Iowa, where something entirely unexpected happened. It was a Sunday afternoon in Clarion, Iowa, 1939. The trees had begun to bloom again. You could feel the edge of spring brushing the wind like an apology. But in the small-town cemetery, behind First Grace Church, a group of men stood silently over a grave that bore no name. Just a wooden marker, just the word, unknown. They were farmers, clerks, fathers, sons, some still wearing work gloves, some holding hats to their chests. They weren't there out of duty. They were there because of what the man had done before he died. No one knew his full name. He'd arrived in town the previous year, thin, weathered, coat 2 sizes too big. He had introduced himself only as Mr. Thomas Sade. He was just passing through, looking for work. The town had seen plenty like him. Drifters, hobos, broken men walking across America, trying to outrun shame or hunger. But Mr. Thomas was different. He didn't ask for charity. He asked for chores. He repaired fences, dug wells, fixed broken shutters, and he never stayed long in one place. But everywhere he worked, he left something behind. A Bible verse scrawled in pencil on the barn wall, a kind word to a grieving widow, a single silver coin tucked under a child's pillow. No one noticed the pattern at first, until one day, when the mayor's son was caught stealing from the corner store, it was Mr. Thomas who sat with the boy for 3 hours behind the church and taught him about honor, not with threats, but with stories. When asked how he knew so much scripture, Mr. Thomas only said, "Once upon a time, I needed saving too." He died quietly. Pneumonia. The doctor said he'd probably been sick for weeks, but never told anyone. They found a tattered notebook in his coat pocket. No money, no identification, just pages filled with names of the towns he'd passed through, and under each one, a list of families he had helped. At the bottom of the last page, it read, "If I've done any good, don't remember me. Just pass it on." That Sunday, the town held a memorial. The boy he mentored, Peter O'Donnell, would go on to become a judge and establish the Thomas Fellowship, a scholarship for students who served their community before themselves. And every Easter since 1940, the congregation of First Grace leaves a single bouquet on that unnamed grave. Because sometimes the greatest messengers don't preach, they walk, they labor, they leave whispers of hope in forgotten corners. And maybe the Great Depression was never about what was taken from us, but about what was revealed within us. Across the country, thousands like Mr. Thomas wandered from town to town, planting seeds no one saw until years later, seeds of generosity, of second chances, of faith that doesn't shout, but serves. So when the Depression finally ended, when jobs returned and radios sang again, and the bread lines faded into history books. It wasn't the economy that had changed the most. It was us. But what if it had to happen that way? What if, beneath the collapse and hunger, there was a plan? A pattern only the divine could see? What if, in our worst moments, we were being taught how to love again? The Great Depression didn't end with a bang. There was no parade, no single day when everyone woke up and said, "It's over." It ended the way storms do, slowly, stubbornly, with puddles and clouds and a lingering dampness in the soul. But something had changed. America had gone into the fire as one kind of people and come out as another. More cautious, yes, more weathered, but also, somehow, more human. We learned that pride builds towers, but it's humility that keeps them standing. That faith isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to keep walking when everything's gone quiet. We learned what a spoon of soup meant when hunger sat at the table. What it meant to give your last coin, not because you had much, but because someone else had less. We discovered how God often hides his greatest lessons inside the very things we beg him to take away. Because the truth is, it wasn't just about the money. It was about how easily we forget where we come from, how quickly comfort becomes entitlement, how silently we drift from the one who gave us everything in the first place. But when the farms dried up, when the lights went out, when the banks closed, that's when the church basements filled. That's when neighbors remembered each other's names. That's when the smallest acts, the spoon, the coat, the prayer, became sacred again. And God, he never left. He just waited for us to look up again, to remember him in the silence, to choose mercy over wealth, grace over gain, one another over self. Because maybe the real economy of heaven doesn't count dollars, but moments of love. So now, decades later, when we think of that long, dark chapter in history, when America lost jobs, homes, pride, and security, we might ask, did we really lose everything? Or did we finally remember what matters most? What would you have done if it were you? Would you have walked back to a child in the dust, opened your door in a snowstorm, given the last of what you had to someone you barely knew? And maybe more importantly, would you still do it now? Because sometimes the test of faith is not how you praise in prosperity, but how you love when everything else is gone. Thank you for sitting with us by the fire tonight. If this story reminded you of something deeper, older, or wiser in your own soul, you're not alone. We're grateful you're part of our little fireside circle. If the story touched your heart, share it to the ones you love. And if you would like to listen to more like it, you know where to find us.